can still feel the cold as I boarded the Ocean Whisperer. I couldn't explain why, but the scent of polished wood and sea salt made me anxious. The first oddity I noticed was the door of cabin 214, which was slightly open despite the crew's assurances that it was empty. Apparently, nobody else on the deck noticed. I'm 32-year-old Portland, Oregon-based freelance photographer Morgan Hayes. Although I don't typically travel alone, I wanted something to divert my attention following the divorce, a week at sea with no deadlines or people pointing fingers at me. My tendency to pick up on subtleties and subtle patterns in chaos is perhaps what led to my troubles. The ship's reputation for luxury, relaxation, and tranquility was the reason I picked this vacation, but in reality, all I needed was peace and quiet, a reprieve from the outside world and the specter of my destroyed marriage. I wasn't searching for fear. It was too exhausting for me. Or so I believed. When I got there, the promenade deck was nearly deserted. Teenagers leaned over fences, couples battled in private, and families passed with coffee cups. But then, there was that door, number 214. It was open just enough to be barely noticeable. Even though the room shouldn't have been occupied, I could see the lights within the cabin flashing. I was compelled by curiosity. I carefully pushed it open. The interior was immaculate and entirely typical, featuring a queen bed, crisply folded covers, and the generic artwork above the headboard that renders hotel rooms unmemorable. Nothing out of the ordinary. However, when I entered, I sensed a draft and heard it, a faint, nearly undetectable murmur. I went cold. There was nobody else present. Leave or stay. There was silence in the hallway. Trying to tell myself it was the wind through the air vent, I laughed uneasily. My photographer's instinct took over, and I even took a picture of the cabin for record. But when I looked at the screen, the interior looked darker than it actually was, with shadows curving strangely around the edges. The ship felt normal later, at supper, or as normal as a luxury liner could be. I chatted briefly about ports and activities with a couple I met on embarkation. I felt grounded by their conversation and laughing, which was like a lifeline. It was unremarkable, serene, and a pleasant change. Cabin 214, don't go back, the waiter muttered, almost inaudibly, as I was about to take a sip of my wine. I paused, wine halfway to my lips. I was able to dismiss it with humor, attributing it to my nervousness or the strain of traveling. However, the mistrust had already been sown. I went to the upper deck later. At first, the fog was thin and innocuous, but I started to feel like I was being watched. I kept seeing the same person by the rail, a man in a dark suit with his hat pulled low, looking out at the horizon as other passengers walked by me without noticing. He vanished every time I blinked. Something had changed by the time I got back to my cabin, number 302. Like an invitation, my door was ajar a little bit. Adrenaline mixed with that strange awareness I couldn't get rid of, and my heart pounded in my chest. Even though the room was vacant, I didn't touch the note that said, "Some doors are meant to be left closed," that had arrived on the desk. I walked back to the promenade deck after leaving the room, trembling. I realized then that something wasn't quite right about the passageways. The numbering was incorrect. Several doors repeated themselves, and cabin 215 appeared before 213. The sound of my footfall sounded odd, like if the walls were closer than they should have been. I stopped and listened in the corridor. From many directions came faint, twisted, laughing. It was layered, overlapping, and hard to find, not the talk of passengers. I spun as I heard the murmur, "Morgan." The corridors are deserted. I had never needed my flashlight until it flickered once. The ship was different at night, I noticed. It shifted. Or maybe I was experiencing it in a different way. I wasn't in charge, anyway. I made an effort to convince myself it was the strain of traveling, that I was dreaming. However, I felt in my heart that my curiosity had already bound me to something that wasn't intended for surviving passengers. I didn't get any sleep that evening. Every engine hum and hull creak had a sense of purpose and deliberateness. In the distance, a door, cabin 214, slammed. Was it my, or what? Unnaturally, The mist rose up against the glass and formed faces that I could almost identify. And I came to the realization that this ship, luxury, comfort, relaxation, was not what it seemed as I stood motionless on the promenade deck. Behind the doors, something patiently watched. It also wanted me to come back. The start of the second day at sea seemed harmless enough. Families were clinking glasses, servers were pacing between tables, and the aroma of freshly baked pastries reminded me that everyday life was still going on somewhere in the dining hall during breakfast. The whispering, the odd numbering, the sense of being watched. For a second, I thought the night before had been a dream. However, the recollection of that letter on my desk, which read, "Some doors are meant to be left closed," persisted. As I sipped my coffee, I observed the employees working quietly and effectively. But then I observed something strange. The man who had been there last night in the dark coat was now standing at the far end of the corridor staring at me. His face was hidden by his hat. I blinked. He was gone when I looked again. Not leaving, simply disappeared. I made the decision to take a daylight tour of the ship's decks in an attempt to restore some control. The upper promenade seemed wide, almost peaceful, but occasionally a hallway would turn in an unexpected direction. Stairwells seemed longer than they should be, cabin numbers repeated, and doors appeared where none should be. Every abnormality chilled me to the bone. I went by cabin 214 once more in the middle of the morning. The door was still closed, as it should have been. However, a slight breeze that smelled of sea salt and ancient wood escaped from the seams. I touched the knob with my hand. Under my fingers, it pulsed a little, warmer than the metal around it. Instinctively, I retreated. I knew the ship was alive, not merely in a symbolic sense. The polished floors, the steel hull, and even the air itself all appeared to respond to my interest. I left, attempting to make sense of my fear. Thomas, a retired engineer from Florida, was a fellow traveler I met later, while perusing the mid-deck lounges. He was gregarious and animated, making jokes about the ship's intricate design. I felt almost normal for the first time in 24 hours. I even chuckled. The lounge's doors then opened by themselves. Someone moved through. It wasn't Thomas, someone else, too tall, too pallid, moving in silence. I felt sick to my stomach. I blinked, and it vanished. Thomas said he must have dreamt it as he laughed uneasily. However, I was aware. By mid-afternoon, the irregularities became more severe. In the hallways, I saw shadows shifting against the rays of the sun. Sometimes, as if they sensed something lurking just out of sight, passengers looked at nothing. When I got back to my cabin with the hopes of sleeping, I saw that the arrangement had altered. My door opened into an unfamiliar hallway with doors that didn't fit the ship's blueprints. Cabin 214 made several appearances. Every time I tried a different door, I discovered the same cabin, exactly the same save for a few minor details, like a slanted photograph, a folded pillow, or a faint murmur coming from inside. I went around cabin 214 all afternoon, noting all the differences. On the desk, there was a scrape that hadn't been there before. On the carpet, faint tracks appeared, but they led nowhere. I experienced a nagging fear as though the ship were pointing me in the direction of something I wasn't prepared to confront. In the evening, I heard it once more, faint but desperate voices coming from the hallways. This time, they seemed to hum with every deck, not just cabin 214. Passengers. Voices intermingled, with some addressing me by names I knew and others using jumbled words I couldn't make out. In the hopes that the sea air would help me decompress, I withdrew to the upper deck. More quickly than usual, the fog came in, curling over the railings and floating like smoke across the deck. Passengers who had been moving hours before, now frozen, pale, with hollow eyes. The knowledge of their existence was oppressive. I decided to confront cabin 214 head-on that evening. After supper, I came back with my heart racing and a flashlight in hand. As I got closer, the corridor changed, the door numbers becoming illogical. I counted 3 consecutive identical doors with the number 214. My back was drenched in sweat. At the first door, I paused and listened. I was drawn in by a gentle voice calling my name, Morgan. I opened the first door. Inside, the bed was made up well, and there was a happy couple's picture on the wall. The chamber suddenly appeared to exhale, with the walls bending slightly inward in a gentle motion. When someone whispered, "Come closer," I flinched back and staggered into cabin 214. The windows were closed, the drapes fluttering, the bed unmade. A shadow covered the face of a figure sitting on the edge of the bed. I went cold. Salt and something metallic, blood perhaps, were in the air. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure said quietly and in an unnaturally human voice. I ran to the third door, which was marked 214. There was nobody in the room, or so it appeared. The lights flickered as the door banged behind me. A gentle scratching started to move closer, circling the walls. A wave of panic swept through. I banged on the door and attempted to open it, but the handle remained fixed. The cabin itself was a trap. The room was alive, and I was within. It was hours, or perhaps minutes. The scratching became into a murmur that repeated, "Curiosity brought you," in terms I could finally comprehend. When I realized the ship was no longer a means of transportation but rather a predator and cabin 214 its bait, I fell to the ground. Curiosity keeps you alive. There was a creaky moan outside, suggesting activity somewhere in the passage. I sensed a subtle change in the deck below me, as though the ship was observing, adapting, or reacting to my anxiety. I tried to block it out by putting my hands to my ears, but the whispers managed to get inside my head. The door swung open after a last harsh sound, metal striking on metal. Anticipating the figure from the earlier cabins, I stood, with my heart pounding. Rather, the hallway was deserted. Mist floated along the corridor. The matching doors of cabin 214 were still lining the wall, slightly open. I realized with dread that tonight would not end, as one of them whispered my name once again, Morgan. Cabin 214 was waiting, changing, and all over the place. Knowing that every step I took would just lead me farther into its labyrinth, the ship was patient and thrived on my curiosity. I gripped my torch and inhaled deeply. There was a door waiting for me somewhere up ahead. I knew I couldn't stop moving, but I wasn't sure if it would lead to freedom or further horror. I was sleep-deprived. The faint, constant vibration underfoot, the ship's hum, had turned into a pulse that matched my own heartbeat. The hallways were twisted in ways that made no sense. Even during the day, stairwells led to floors that shouldn't have been there. Doors opened into rooms I didn't recognize, and I was no longer able to trust maps or signage. I'm Morgan Hayes, a 32-year-old freelance photographer who believed she could take a week off from reality. The Ocean Whisperer, however, had other ideas. In my thoughts, cabin 214 had turned into a ghost that followed me everywhere. It followed me like a shadow I couldn't get rid of, even when I completely avoided that corridor. The murmurs were all over by the third night, seeping from the vents and flickering through the PA system, not just in the hallways but even inside the cabins. Some of the voices were guttural, pleading with me to stop, go, or take a closer look. Other times, they were passengers I had previously spoken to, laughing or yelling names. I made an effort to divert my attention. The dining hall was almost deserted when I went for a coffee run in the middle of the morning. Silverware was neatly placed, and the polished tables glinted in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. It was almost normal for a second, nearly. Then I saw the chairs, 3 of them vacant, standing in a circle, rocking a little as though someone had just gotten out of them. There was nobody. The engine's hum had changed. I became aware that I was no longer hearing a machine. I could hear intent. Desperate for some anchor, I went back to my cabin. As I got closer, the hallway felt strangely long, and the numbers on the doors alternated between skipping and repeating. Cabin 214 reappeared, closer this time, but still completely out of place. Knowing that I would intervene due to an uncontrollable urge, I hesitated. The room was different inside. They pressed the bed up against the wall. On the floor, was an upside-down chair. Shadows gathered in places they shouldn't be. Then I noticed it, an open notepad on the desk. My own handwriting covered the pages, detailing things I hadn't done yet, observations I hadn't made, each statement more specific than I could possibly remember. The phrase, "do not leave," caught my attention. I felt a shiver go down my spine. The ship knows you. I staggered back and dropped the notebook. The floorboards groaned, and the walls breathed in time with the whispers, giving the impression that the chamber was pulsing. Then I saw a figure standing close to the window, the same long, pale man as before, with his face shadowed by his hat. "Curiosity is not harmless," he muttered, raising a finger toward the hallway. I sprinted out of the room, flashlight swinging wildly. The hallway behind me went on forever. I went by several identical doors with the number 214, all of which spoke my name. I jumped at the sound of a door slamming, a sharp screech. The door I had just left was gone when I turned to look behind me. Another 214, perfectly aligned and completely silent, took its place. I tried to convince myself that it was stress, fatigue, or my imagination. But as I got to the middle deck of the ship, that reasoning collapsed. Pale, unblinking, and gazing out into the fog, a passenger, a young woman I had seen in the dining hall that morning, was leaning on the railing. I walked carefully up. Her eyes were vacant, and her lips formed words I couldn't hear. Then I heard her turn and understood that I was yelling my name. I started to panic. As I ran, I rounded corners and descended stairs that seemed to go on forever. A voice I recognized as the captain shouted, "Welcome aboard the Ocean Whisperer," as the PA system crackled. The only incorrect intonation was the slower, distorted, mocking tone. "Enjoy your visit." It was the ship itself. I was back on the top deck hours later, or perhaps minutes later. Beyond the wall of thickening fog, I could see moving objects. People stopped in mid-step, crew members staring blankly, and figures that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as fast. The doors of cabin 214 were now lined up along the deck railing, floating, unachievable. At that moment, I realized that the ship had ingested the passengers, the staff, and the architecture. It could materialize anything it desired to entice me. I gave a lifeboat a try. The door opened into a tiny, claustrophobic room, yet when I peered out, the sea was black and everlasting. The ship stayed completely steady, but the rope ladders dangled and swayed slightly. I understood that the ocean didn't matter. The ship sailed the passengers, perceptions and fears, not the ocean. I leaned against the lifeboat wall, exhausted. I turned as I heard a whisper behind me. One more choice. Far out from the railings, on the deck itself, stood three similar doors, 214. There was a slight glimmer coming from each door, and I had to go through. I paused. Freedom could be just one step away. A single step could result in oblivion. I heard the tapping once more, a deliberate, repetitive sound coming from the fog. It mirrored my heartbeat. I felt the air getting thicker as I swallowed deeply. One of the doors then opened by itself. A hand extended itself. The fog was dense and oppressive, pressing down on me like a living thing. The faint glimmer of the floating doors marked 214 beckoned me to come forward, each heartbeat echoing off them. I'm Morgan Hayes, a 32-year-old photojournalist who believed she could take a week off from the world. Ocean Whisperer, however, had different plans. The shadow of the hand from the open door stretched strangely as it hovered. I sensed its presence drawing me in with the promise of freedom, answers, or worse. Despite my best efforts to resist the attraction, I tightened my fists and moved closer out of instinct. The ship moved abruptly beneath me before I could respond anymore. Muffled voices rushed through the gloom, like wind through hollow hallways, and a groan of steel reverberated. I glanced around. The people I had previously seen, the joyful couples, the laughing families, now seemed translucent and motionless, with some silently reaching out to me. They appeared to be waiting for me to join the ship, their faces contorted with fear and excitement. I sprinted, avoiding the mist, the floating doors, and the hands. Step forward. Step forward. I turned bends that looped impossible back on themselves as the PA system crackled, distorted, and repeated my own words in a slow, mocking tempo. All of the exits I attempted led to further 214 doors. Every door lured, murmured, and offered something I couldn't refuse yet didn't want. The warning, "Some doors are meant to be left closed," rang in my head like a siren of reason opposing the ship's pull. I recalled the note from earlier. I wanted to get out, get away, and find something real. However, the hallways went on forever, and I could hear my name reverberating in a tone that made me feel cold. Next, I saw a door that was a little different from the others. It had a single rusty handle, a damaged frame, and flaking paint. I felt deep down that it was unique, yet welcoming. I reached for it against my better judgment. The fog surged, swirling about me like storm waves as soon as my hand touched the handle. Layers and overlaps of whispers turned into screams, a chorus of passengers lost in the ship's hunger. I opened the door. I discovered nothing inside, or nothing I could understand anyway. The chamber seemed to go on forever, the ceiling disappearing and the walls blending into the night. On the glossy floor, I could see my own shaking, wide-eyed reflection, but it moved on its own. It smiled after raising a warning hand. From everywhere, a quiet, purposeful voice said, "You were brought by curiosity. You can only be saved by curiosity." Fear flared. I took a step back. The corridor of floating doors behind me curved and wavered as though it were alive. The doors opened one by one, letting in views of other travelers, some yelling, some quiet, all of them waiting and gazing. I was the newest target for the ship, which was ravenous for interaction and attention. I staggered forward, trying to get away. The dim light pulsing like a heartbeat came from one of the doors, the one with the peeling frame. I entered. Compared to the fog outside, the air seemed colder and harsher. Silence for a minute. Then there was a slight knock in the distant corner. Closer, another knock. I went cold. I muttered to myself, almost as a mantra, almost as a connection to reality. If you're listening, take a moment to subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep stories like this alive. Speaking it aloud helped me focus and provided a little sense of stability in the midst of the chaos. The tapping grew louder, more rhythmic, impatient. Along the walls, shadows became longer, creating unnatural shapes. A warped image of myself materialized on the floor, with wide eyes and a silently moving mouth. Subsequently, the hand extended once more, this time unexpectedly, nearly passing through me. The ship didn't want me to leave, I finally realized. It urged me to make a decision. You could move ahead, embrace the doors, enter its maze, or take a step back and let curiosity die. But it was hard to back off. With my heart pounding, I closed my eyes and felt the floor under me change, the walls breathing, the mist growing thicker. Then, in a single murmur, "Morgan, choose." I opened my eyes and made a decision. The doors had vanished. All that was left was the fog, alive and moving, around me. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of motors that matched my own heartbeat. I realized then that the ship was endless and patient, and that I had been its plaything ever since I stepped on board. How long I stood there is a mystery to me. Time didn't seem to matter. I only knew that one step may lead to my demise or the start of something much worse. Then I noticed a door, gleaming dimly in the fog. Not 214, not marked in any way. Just there. My interest grew. I yelled in dread. I made contact. I then came to a standstill, because I saw the entire Ocean Whisperer, boundless, living, and staring back at me in the reflection on its surface, not just the room or the hallways. I was unable to determine whether it had always been me or if it wanted me to enter. I have no idea how long I stayed motionless before the fog started to move in a different way. It moved purposefully, as if it were watching me, picking up on my hesitations and testing my impulses, rather than circling aimlessly or floating with the wind. I'm Morgan Hayes, a 32-year-old Portland freelance photographer. I should have run for anything substantial and turned around, but curiosity got the better of me. Pieces of me had already been taken by the ship, and my own reflection moved on its own to tell me that I was powerless. Like a heartbeat compared to mine, the bright door in the mist pulsed once more, although more slowly this time. Around it, shadows gathered, and then I caught glimpses of the faint forms of other passengers, the ones who had been motionless, pale and faceless, drifting just out of my field of sight. Soft, overlapping whispers could be heard once more, and I caught snippets of sentences that made my stomach turn. "You will see, you will join forever." I stepped nearer the entrance. As though the mist itself were a floor, firm but pliable, my foot sank a little. Below me, the ship let out a loud, resonant moan that sent shivers down my spine. I discovered that the corridor I had came from. The halls, and even the top decks didn't exist as I had assumed when the floor began to ripple. Around me, the ship had changed, molded by curiosity, dread, and attention. I was drawn nearer to its design with each heartbeat. The fog grew thicker and pressed against my skin as I attempted to run, and I fell into one of the 214 floating doors that had resurfaced behind me. The same smell of saline and metal that had plagued me since the first night returned as I slammed it shut, my heart thumping, and felt the familiar draft of chilly air. I was torn between two impossibilities, the luminous door in front of me and the constant 214 doors behind me. I knew there was nowhere safe for me to go. A voice rose from the mist, soft and horrifyingly human. "Morgan," I said, but it was warped and echoed in a way that no real mouth could. "You have been observed by the ship. It is familiar with you." I tried to block out the murmurs by pressing my palms to my eyes, but they persisted. "You will stay." They woven themselves into my mind, reliving each step I had taken on this ship, each question, each look at cabin 214, each decision I had made. After feeding on me, the ship now presented me with an option I couldn't turn down. Another step. The luminous door was touched by one hand. In front of me, my reflection appeared in the fog, now impossible to see. It said, "Curiosity brought you," and grinned, a sly, calculating smile. "Move forward, or stay lost forever." I remained motionless. I was immobile. Then I sensed a pull, faint at first, like gravity dragging me to the door, then strong, like the ship itself beckoning me into its endless passageways. Fragments of the life it had previously sucked were visible to me, faces in the fog, twisted in silent cries, motionless. Some were shadows I couldn't make out, some were crew, and some were passengers, they observed, patiently waiting. And in the middle of it all, cabin 214 hung there, unique, bigger than life, and dimly flickering. At that moment, I realized it was more than just a door or a chamber. It was the ship's center, the trap that piqued interest and used it as fuel. I wanted to back off, to get away. Anywhere that wasn't here was where I wanted to run. However, the fog felt heavy, and every step was like trudging in syrup. My pulse pounded in my ears as I breathed in quick spurts. My name was repeatedly spoken by the mist. Then I noticed it, an additional hand coming out of the bright entrance. Human, not real, and not yet non-human. Curiosity overcame fear as I reached for it out of instinct, and the fog became thicker, engulfing the deck, the doors, and my entire surroundings. I have no idea what came next. I recall feeling drawn forward, as though I were moving, losing my weight, and becoming a part of something bigger than myself. Then there was stillness. I can sense the ship now. Its heartbeat. It is awaiting. The fog shifts, the doors move, and I watch every time a new person boards. In a way, I'm still here, connected, watching, stuck in this maze of 214 doors and floating hallways. Additionally, keep in mind that some doors are intended to remain closed if you ever find yourself on the Ocean Whisperer, exploring the upper decks in the fog. It's preferable to disregard certain curiosities, because the ship will never let you go once it discovers you. And I hear my own name spoken once more somewhere in the haze.